The sun hung high and hateful over the Texas scrubland, a blinding white disk that seemed determined to bake the moisture out of every living thing in Dry Creek. It was late August of 1878, and the heat was not just a temperature, it was a physical weight, pressing down on the brim of Eliza Hart's bonnet and settling into the dust that coated her faded calico dress. Eliza rode with her back straight, a posture born less of pride than of necessity. Balanced precariously on the pommel of her saddle was a woven willow basket, lined with straw and filled with 3 dozen brown eggs. They were small things, fragile and unassuming, but to Eliza, they weighed as much as gold bullion. They represented the interest payment on a loan that hung over her father's head like an executioner's axe. She nudged her mare, a patient roan named Bess, into a slow trot. The horse huffed, kicking up puffs of red dust that hung in the still air. Around them, the landscape stretched out in a vast, indifferent panorama of sagebrush and mesquite, broken only by the distant, jagged spine of the mountains to the west. That was the edge of the known world for the people of Dry Creek. Beyond those ridges lay the Comancheria, the hunting grounds of the Comanche, a place spoken of in town with a mixture of terrified whispers and violent bravado. Eliza knew what they called her in town. She had sharp ears, and the men who idled on the porch of the saloon rarely lowered their voices when she passed. "There goes the virgin with the egg basket," they would say, followed by a stream of tobacco juice and a chuckle that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. It was a nickname that stung, primarily because it was true. At 22 years old, Eliza was an anomaly in a frontier town where women usually married by 16 and were worn out by 30. She had no husband, no suitors, and, if the gossip were to be believed, no prospects. She was just Eliza, the girl who managed a failing farm for a father whose lungs were slowly turning to stone, the girl who guarded her virtue with the same fierce desperation she guarded her chickens. She hated the nickname. It made her feel like a prize cow at a county fair, defined entirely by what she had not yet given away. Yet, there was a steel rod of stubbornness in her spine. Let them talk. Talk was cheap. Eggs were real. The land was real. As the road curved around a limestone outcrop, the town of Dry Creek came into view. It was a collection of raw timber buildings bleached gray by the sun, strung out along a single muddy thoroughfare. Even from this distance, the tension in the air was palpable. For the past week, talk of raiding parties had spread like wildfire. A rancher 10 miles south had lost 20 head of cattle. A freight wagon had been overturned and looted near the river crossing. The word Comanche was on every tongue, spoken with a venom that masked a deep, shivering fear. The town was a powder keg, and every shadow looked like a warrior to the jumpy eyes of the settlers. Eliza tightened her grip on the reins. She had no time for fear. Fear did not pay the bank. Fear did not buy medicine for Dr. Evans to bring to her father. She was nearing the narrow pass where the road dipped into a dry wash before climbing up to the main street when she heard the thunder of hooves. It was not the rhythmic trot of a single rider, but the chaotic, panicked clatter of a team out of control. Eliza pulled Bess to the side of the trail, pressing close to a dense thicket of chaparral. Around the bend careened a heavy freight wagon, swaying violently from side to side. The driver was screaming, sawing uselessly at the reins. Eliza recognized him instantly. It was Elias Pike, the owner of the mercantile and the very man who held the note on her father's land. The 2 draft horses pulling the wagon were wide-eyed with terror, foaming at the mouth. A rattlesnake or a sudden coyote must have spooked them, and now they were a runaway train of muscle and wood. "Whoa, damn you! Hold up!" Pike shrieked, his face a mask of red fury and panic. The wagon hit a rut. The left wheels lifted dangerously off the ground. The vehicle was tipping, and its momentum was carrying it straight toward where Eliza and Bess were pinned against the brush. Eliza gasped, clutching the egg basket to her chest with one hand and hauling on the reins with the other. Bess whinnied and tried to rear, but there was nowhere to go. The massive wooden side of the wagon loomed over them, blotting out the sun. Eliza braced herself for the crushing impact, squeezing her eyes shut. It never came. There was a blur of motion from the brush on the opposite side of the road. A rider burst forth, not with a shout, but in a silence that was almost supernatural. He rode a paint horse that moved with fluid, predatory grace. The rider cut diagonally across the path of the runaway team. It was a maneuver so reckless it stopped Eliza's heart. He leaned low, almost hanging off the side of his mount, and grabbed the bridle of the lead draft horse close to the bit, with a display of strength that rippled through his bare shoulders. The rider wrenched the lead horse's head to the right. He forced the team into a tight circle, using the weight of his own horse as a brake. Dust exploded into the air, choking and thick. The wagon slammed back down onto all four wheels with a bone-jarring thud. The draft horses squealed and skidded, their hooves carving deep furrows in the hard earth, until they finally shuddered to a halt, heaving and trembling. Silence rushed back into the wash, broken only by the wheezing of the horses and the harsh rasp of Pike's breathing. Eliza coughed, waving the red dust away from her face. She looked up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The savior sat on his paint horse 10 feet away, perfectly still. He was a Comanche. There was no mistaking the profile, the way he sat his horse as if he were part of the animal's spine. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple calico shirt that had seen better days, open at the throat. His hair was black as a raven's wing, parted in the center. He was looking directly at her. Eliza felt a jolt go through her, sharper than the fear of the crash. His eyes were dark, devoid of the panic that currently flooded her own veins. They were calm, but it was the calmness of a deep river that could drown a man without a sound. He was young, perhaps a few years older than her, with a face that seemed carved from the very limestone of the hills, hard, angular, and strikingly handsome in a way that made her breath hitch. He looked at the wagon, then at Eliza, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to the basket of eggs she still clutched miraculously unbroken in her arm. He nudged his horse a step closer. The paint horse tossed its head, the only sound in the tense standoff. "Hold tight," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the English words heavily accented but clear. It was not a question. It was a command, or perhaps a piece of advice given from one survivor to another. Before Eliza could find her tongue, before Elias Pike could scramble down from his wagon seat and reach for the shotgun strapped underneath it, the Comanche turned his mount. With a subtle shift of his weight, the horse spun on its hindquarters and vanished back into the thick brush, as if he had been a mirage conjured by the heat. "Did you see that?" Pike's voice broke the spell. He tumbled down from the wagon, his expensive suit covered in dust, his face purple. He stumbled around, looking at the empty brush, then at his trembling horses. "A savage! A damn savage right here on the town road!" He turned his watery blue eyes on Eliza. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not ask if she was all right. He looked at her as if she were part of the scenery that had inconvenienced him. "You saw him, didn't you? Girl a buck, trying to ambush my wagon." Eliza looked at Pike. She remembered the way the warrior had grabbed the bridle, the way he had saved Pike's neck and her own life. "He stopped the horses. Mr. Pike, he saved the wagon." Pike spat on the ground, a glob of tobacco landing near Bess's hoof. "Saved it. He was likely trying to cut the traces and steal the team. Scared him off. I did. Reached for my scattergun, and he ran like a coyote." Eliza tightened her jaw. She knew what she had seen. She knew what she had felt when those dark eyes held hers. But she also knew who Elias Pike was. Arguing with him was like wrestling a pig in mud. You only got dirty, and the pig liked it. "I need to get to market, Mr. Pike," Eliza said coldly. "My eggs will spoil in this heat." Pike wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at her. The fear in his face was replaced by a familiar, oily sneer. "Ah, yes, the eggs, always the eggs. See you at the store. Miss Hart, don't keep me waiting. You know I have a schedule." He climbed back onto his wagon, whipping the exhausted horses into a sullen walk toward town. Eliza waited until the dust settled before she urged Bess forward. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be still. She checked the basket. Not a single shell was cracked. It was a small miracle in a land that did not offer many. When Eliza rode into Dry Creek, the atmosphere was thick enough to chew. Men stood in knots on the boardwalks, hands resting on pistol grips. Women hurried from shop to shop, clutching their children close. The fear of the Indian threat had turned the town into a fortress of paranoia. She tied Bess to the hitching rail in front of Pike's General Mercantile. The sign above the door was peeling, but the windows were clean. Pike liked to see who was coming to owe him money. Inside, the store smelled of vinegar, raw wool, and stale cigar smoke. It was dim and cool compared to the furnace outside. Pike was already behind the counter, having apparently recovered his composure, though his suit was still dusty. Eliza placed the basket on the counter. 3 dozen, Mr. Pike, fresh this morning. Pike did not look at the eggs. He leaned over the counter, his knuckles white as he pressed them into the wood. He was a large man, soft in the middle but with a hardness around the eyes that came from years of squeezing profit out of desperate neighbors. "The market is flooded. Eliza," he said, dropping the formality of Miss. "Everyone is selling what they have before the savages come and burn it all down. Supply and demand." "These are the only fresh eggs in town, and you know it," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "The hens are not laying well in this heat. Mine are—" 10 cents a dozen, Pike said flatly. "The price was 20 cents last week. Last week I almost didn't get killed by a Comanche raider on the road." Pike lied smoothly. "Hazard pay, inflation, call it what you like. 10 cents. "I need 15, Eliza insisted. "Dr. Evans needs to be paid for my father's medicine, and the interest on the note is due on the 1st. Pike smiled, and it was a grotesque expression that showed too many yellow teeth. He reached out, his hand hovering over the basket, then moving to brush against Eliza's gloved hand resting on the counter. She pulled back as if burned. "You know, Eliza," Pike purred, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made her skin crawl. "There are other ways to pay a debt. A pretty thing like you. It is a waste, really. Carrying eggs like a peasant. You could be carrying silk. You could be sleeping in a feather bed instead of that drafty shack." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of onions. "I am a man of means. I could be flexible if you were willing to sell something other than eggs. Something a little more personal." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He was calling her a whore, but wrapping it in the language of business. He was using her father's impending death and their poverty as a lever to pry open her legs. Eliza felt a cold rage settle in her chest. It was icy and sharp. She wanted to slap his sweating face. She wanted to smash the basket of eggs over his head and watch the yolks run down his expensive suit. But she thought of her father, coughing his life away in the back room of their small cabin. She thought of the deed to the land, the only thing her mother had left them, currently sitting in Pike's iron safe. She swallowed her pride. It tasted like bitter ash. 30 cents for the lot, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Take it or I walk." Pike stared at her for a long moment, his eyes roaming over her bodice, looking for a weakness. He saw none, just the rigid posture of the virgin with the egg basket. He snorted, disappointed but calculating. He opened the till and counted out the coins. 30 cents, but remember, Eliza, the 1st of the month is coming, and if you are 1 penny short, I take the farm, and then, well, then you won't have a roof to be virtuous under. Will you?" He slid the coins across the counter. Eliza scooped them up, her fingers not touching his. She left the basket and walked out, her boots striking the floorboards with military precision. As she stepped back out into the blinding sun, the town was buzzing with a new energy. A group of men had gathered near the sheriff's office. She recognized the deputy, Sam Dyer, a man with a face like a hatchet and a soul to match. "I am telling you," a man was shouting, gesturing wildly toward the west. "I saw him up on the ridge near the old creek bed, a paint horse, war paint on his face. He was scouting the town." "Pike said he attacked his wagon," another voice chimed in. "Tried to kill him and the Hart girl," Eliza froze. The lie had already taken root. "We need a posse," Dyer shouted, hitching up his gun belt. "We cannot wait for the army. We hunt him down before he brings the whole tribe down on us." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. They were scared, and fear needed a target. Eliza untied Bess, her hands moving mechanically. She looked toward the distant hills, shimmering in the heat haze. Somewhere out there was the man who had saved her life. The man who had said, "Hold tight." He was not a scout for a raiding party. He was not a monster. But the town of Dry Creek did not care about the truth. They wanted blood to water the dry land. As she mounted her horse, Eliza felt a strange, terrifying certainty. This was not over. The threads of her life, previously woven only of eggs and debt and duty, had just been knotted together with that of the Comanche warrior. And as the men checked their rifles and saddled their horses, she knew that the nest she had fought so hard to protect was about to be blown away by the coming storm. She turned Bess toward home, but her eyes lingered on the western horizon. The dust from the posse was already beginning to rise. The smell of smoke did not come from a dream. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around Eliza's throat and pulled her violently from her sleep. For a moment, in the disorientation of the dark, she thought she had left the stove damper open. Then she heard the sound a roar like a rushing river, but crackling and hungry. It was the sound of dry timber screaming as it died. Eliza threw off her quilt and scrambled to the window. The world outside, usually a canvas of deep blues and silvers under the moonlight, was bathed in a hellish orange glow. The barn was burning. "Papa, get up!" she screamed, though she knew her father's drug-heavy sleep would be hard to break. She shoved her feet into her boots without bothering with stockings, grabbed her shawl, and threw open the cabin door. The heat hit her instantly, a physical wall that dried the moisture in her eyes. The barn, the structure her grandfather had raised with his own hands 40 years ago, was a skeleton of fire. The roof had already partially collapsed, sending sparks spiraling up into the black sky like angry fireflies. Eliza ran toward the inferno, grabbing a bucket from the well trough as she went, but she stopped 10 yards out. It was hopeless. The heat was searing, singing the hair on her arms. "The horses," she gasped, dropping the bucket. But the corral gate was swinging open, the iron hinges glowing red from the reflection of the flames. It had not been broken. It had been unlatched. She searched for the livestock. Bess, her mare, was gone. The 2 milk cows were gone. And worst of all, Samson, the prize stallion her father had bet their entire future on the breeding stock that was supposed to pay off the loan to Elias Pike next spring, was gone. Eliza stood amidst the falling ash, her chest heaving, listening to the crackle of the flames devouring her heritage. She looked down at the dirt. In the flickering orange light, the ground told the story. Hoof prints, dozens of them, deep and frantic, churning the earth, leading away from the barn and toward the western ridge, toward the valley, toward the Comanche. By the time the sun dragged itself over the horizon, the barn was nothing but a pile of smoldering charcoal and twisted iron nails. The smoke hung low over the farm, a gray shroud of defeat. Neighbors from the nearest homesteads, attracted by the glow in the night, had ridden over, but they were too late to do anything but stare and spit tobacco juice into the ashes. "It was them," a rancher named Old Man Miller said, pointing a gnarled finger toward the west. "Comanches. See the tracks unshod ponies mixed with the stolen stock. They came in the night, quiet as snakes." Eliza stood by the well, her face smeared with soot, her hands raw from moving debris that was too hot to touch. She felt hollowed out. "Why?" she whispered. "Why burn it if they wanted the horses? Why burn the shelter? Meanness," Miller spat. "Pure savagery. They want to drive us out. Girl, they want to scare you off this land." Around mid-morning, a rider approached from the direction of town. It was Deputy Sam Dyer. He rode a tall bay gelding that looked too well fed for a lawman's salary. Dyer was a thin man with a mustache that he waxed into sharp points, and eyes that always seemed to be undressing whatever they looked at. He did not dismount. He sat high in his saddle, looking down at Eliza and the ruin of the barn. "Terrible business, Miss Hart," Dyer said, taking a slow drag from a thin cigar. "Truly terrible. Elias Pike told me he saw smoke from his balcony. Send me to investigate." "They took everything. Deputy," Eliza said, her voice raspy from smoke inhalation. "The stallion, the cows, Bess." Dyer nodded slowly, inspecting the ash on the tip of his cigar. "Comanches. No doubt. The whole town is in an uproar. Pike says they are getting bolder because there isn't enough civilizing influence out here. Are you going to form a posse?" Eliza asked, a spark of anger cutting through her exhaustion. "Are you going to go get my property back?" Dyer chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Go into the canyons chasing ghosts, with what men the army is stretched thin, and the townfolk are scared. Eliza, they are staying close to their own fires tonight." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the saddle horn. The leather creaked. "You know, Elias Pike was very distressed when he heard. He worries about you out here. A woman alone, with a sick father. It is dangerous. The savages smell weakness." Eliza wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of black ash. "We are not weak. You are broke," Dyer corrected her, his voice dropping to a murmur that was meant to be intimate but felt like slime. "And now you have no stock to pay the note. Pike mentioned that. He said he would hate to foreclose on a tragedy. He is a man of heart. Eliza, if you were to appeal to that heart." Eliza went still. "What are you saying?" "Deputy, I am saying that Elias is a lonely man," Dyer said, his eyes raking over her soot-stained dress. "He has a fondness for you. He thinks you are proud, but maybe too proud for your own good. If you were to go to him, show him some gratitude. Be friendly. Let him know that you appreciate his protection. Well, a man like that can make debts disappear. He can make sure the sheriff posts a guard out here every night." The implication was as subtle as a slap in the face. Sell the land, or sell the body. Those were the options the law was offering her. Eliza grabbed the broom she'd been using to sweep ash from the porch. She gripped the handle until her knuckles turned white. "Get off my land," she said. Her voice was low, trembling not with fear, but with a rage so hot it rivaled the fire from the night before. Dyer blinked, surprised. "Now, Eliza, be reasonable." "I said get out," she screamed, swinging the broom. The straw bristles slapped against the flank of his horse. The bay gelding started, dancing sideways. Dyer fought the reins, his face flushing red. "You are making a mistake. Girl, we cannot protect you if you don't cooperate. When the Comanches come back for you, and they will come for you, don't you scream for the law." "I don't need your law," Eliza yelled as he wheeled his horse around. "And tell Pike that if he wants this land, he will have to drag my dead body off it." Dyer spurred his horse, galloping away in a cloud of dust, leaving Eliza standing alone in the wreckage of her life. She stood there until the dust settled, then turned and went inside the cabin. The air inside was thick with the smell of sickness, camphor, and stale sweat. Her father, Jeremiah Hart, lay on the narrow cot in the corner. He was a shadow of the man he had been, his chest heaving with every breath, the consumption eating him from the inside out. He had heard the shouting. He looked at her with watery, terrified eyes. "Eliza," he wheezed, reaching out a skeletal hand. Was that the deputy as Pike?" "Is he taking the farm?" Eliza crossed the room and took his hand. It was cold, despite the heat of the day. She sat on the edge of the bed, forcing a strength into her voice that she did not feel. "No, Pa, nobody is taking the farm." "The barn," he coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "The stallion, it's all gone. Eliza, we have nothing. Maybe you should," Pike said. "Hush," she said sharply, squeezing his hand. "Don't you say it. Don't you ever say it." She leaned in close, her blue eyes blazing in the dim light. "We still have the chickens. We still have the garden. I will carry eggs to market every single day if I have to. I will walk until my feet bleed. I will work until my back breaks, but I will not sell myself to Elias Pike. Do you hear me? I will keep this land, and I will keep my name clean." Jeremiah looked at his daughter, seeing the steel in her that he had lost long ago. He nodded weakly, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. "You're a good girl, Eliza. Too good for this hard world." "I don't need to be good," she whispered, looking out the window at the smoking ruins. "I need to be strong." The next morning, the reality of her promise set in. Without Bess, Eliza had to walk the 6 miles to town. She rose before the sun, gathered every egg the terrified hens had managed to lay 4 dozen, and packed the basket with extra straw. She set out on foot, the heavy basket digging into the crook of her arm. The road was lonely and quiet. Every rustle of the sagebrush made her heart jump. She kept her eyes on the ground, scanning the dirt, reading the story of the night before, about 2 miles from the farm, near a bend where the creek bed ran close to the road. She stopped. There were fresh tracks crossing the road, headed south toward the river, away from the path the raiders had allegedly taken. She knelt, balancing the basket carefully. They were horse tracks, but not the unshod ponies of the raiding party. These were shod hooves, but one shoe on the right foreleg had a distinctive crack in the iron, a mark she had seen just 2 days ago. It was the paint horse, the horse of the Comanche who had saved her from the wagon. He had been here, recently, maybe this morning. A sensible woman would have run. A sensible woman would have kept her head down and walked straight to the sheriff's office. But Eliza was tired of being sensible, and she was tired of being afraid. The tracks didn't lead toward the town or the raids. They led toward the river, to a secluded grove of cottonwoods and willows. Driven by an instinct she couldn't name, a desperate hope that perhaps not every man in this territory was a wolf waiting to devour her, Eliza turned off the road. She followed the tracks, moving silently through the tall grass, the river's murmur growing louder. She broke through a line of brush and stepped onto the sandy bank of the river. She was not alone, but it was not the Comanche she found. 3 men were gathered by the water's edge, skinning a deer hanging from a low branch. They were white men, rough-looking, with grease-stained buckskins and beards that reached their chests. Buffalo hunters. By the look of the heavy Sharps rifles leaned against a log, they smelled of old blood and unwashed bodies. They stopped their work as Eliza stepped into the clearing, 6 eyes fixed on her, widening in surprise and then narrowing with predatory interest. "Well, looky here," the biggest one said, wiping a bloody knife on his trousers. He had a scar running through his eyebrow and teeth that were brown with tobacco. "If it isn't the egg lady, wandering far from the coop. Aren't you, little hen?" Eliza backed up a step, clutching her basket. "I am just passing through. I took a wrong turn." "A wrong turn indeed," another man snickered, stepping to flank her. "This is a war country. Missy, Comanches everywhere. We just chased one off not an hour ago. Big buck, riding a paint. Put a scare into him." Eliza's heart sank. So he had been here, and these men had driven him off. "I will be going now," Eliza said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Now, don't be rude," the big man said, stepping between her and the path back to the road. He grinned, and it was a terrifying sight. "You can't just walk around out here unprotected. A pretty thing like you, the savages would eat you alive. You need protection. Men who know how to handle things." He took a step closer. The air in the clearing seemed to drop 20 degrees. "We act as a toll, you see," the third man said, licking his lips. "For keeping the path safe. What do you have in that basket, Eggs?" He reached out and snatched the basket from her arm. Eliza cried out, but he shoved her back. He looked inside, then laughed, kicking the basket over. The eggs spilled onto the rocky ground, shattering. Yolks and whites ran over the stones, bright yellow against the gray river mud. "Oops," he laughed. "Looks like you have nothing to pay for now. Nothing but, well, virgin bringing eggs into war country," the big man mocked, looming over her. "That is like bringing a steak to a wolf den. Maybe we should teach you a lesson about safety." Eliza backed up until her boots hit the water. She had no weapon. She had nothing but her fear and her rage. "Stay back," she warned, though she knew it was useless. "Or what?" the big man sneered. "You gonna cluck at us?" Suddenly, the brush behind the hunters did not rustle. It did not snap. It simply parted. The Comanche warrior stepped into the clearing. He moved with a silence that made the hunters look like clumsy children. He was not riding. He was on foot, standing tall and broad-shouldered. He held a Winchester repeating rifle in his hand, not a bow, not a spear, but a well-oiled piece of white man's machinery. "Step away," the warrior said. His voice was calm, the English crisp and accented, carrying more authority than any shout. The hunters spun around, reaching for their heavy single-shot rifles leaning against the log, but they were too far away. The Comanche levered around into the chamber of his Winchester with a metallic clack-clack that echoed loudly in the clearing. The big hunter froze. He looked at the Indian, then at the gun. He blinked, confused. That's a repeater. Where did a buck get a repeater?" "I said step away," the warrior repeated. His eyes were dark obsidian, hard and unyielding. He did not look at Eliza. His focus was entirely on the threat. The hunters backed off, hands raised halfway. They were bullies, and like all bullies, they crumbled when faced with a superior force. But the big man, the leader, had too much pride to simply run. He looked from the warrior to Eliza, shivering by the water, and a nasty, vile grin spread across his face. "You want her for yourself, is that it?" the hunter spat. "Going to take her back to your teepee. Tell you what, Chief, she is a tight little thing. We were just discussing it. We could go hunting the nest inside this little hen together." The vulgarity hung in the air, gross and heavy. Eliza felt bile rise in her throat. The metaphor was clear, violent, and humiliating. The Comanche's expression did not change, but his eyes went cold, a terrifying, absolute zero. In a blur of motion, he lowered the rifle barrel with his left hand and, with his right, drew a heavy Bowie knife from his belt. He didn't lunge. He threw it. The blade flashed in the sunlight, a streak of silver lightning. "Thanks." The knife buried itself deep into the trunk of the willow tree, less than 1 inch from the big hunter's ear. It quivered there with a hum that set Eliza's teeth on edge. A few strands of the hunter's greasy hair, severed by the blade, floated slowly to the ground. The hunter turned pale, his eyes bulging. He wet himself. The dark stain spread across the front of his buckskins. The warrior took one slow step forward. "You don't hunt what isn't yours," he said. The words were spoken slowly, each syllable weighted with a threat of immediate, violent death. The hunters scrambled. They tripped over themselves, leaving their deer carcass, leaving their dignity, grabbing their rifles and crashing through the brush in a panicked stampede toward the road. Eliza stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at the smashed eggs on the ground, her livelihood, her father's medicine ruined. Then she looked up at the man who had saved her. He walked over to the tree and pulled his knife free with a single, sharp tug. He wiped the blade on his leggings and sheathed it. Finally, he looked at her. Eliza trembled. The stories said he should be the monster. The town said he was the one who burned her barn. But the white men were the ones who had cornered her, and the savage was the one who had stopped them. Her world tilted on its axis. The clear line between civilized and wild blurred and dissolved. Did you burn my barn?" she whispered, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. He looked at her, his face impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps insult, perhaps pity. "Fire is a coward's weapon," he said simply. "I am not a coward." He looked down at the broken eggs, then back at her. "Go, the town is that way." He turned to leave, moving back toward the dense tree line where his horse must have been hidden. "Wait," Eliza called out. She didn't know why. She didn't know his name. "Thank you." He paused but did not look back. He vanished into the shadows of the cottonwoods. Eliza gathered herself, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. She left the basket. There was nothing to salvage. She began the trek toward the town. Keeping to the edge of the road, she felt eyes on her. Not the predatory gaze of the hunters, but a steady, heavy presence. She looked up toward the ridge that ran parallel to the road. There, moving through the scrub oak and rocks, was the silhouette of the rider on the paint horse. He was not approaching her, but he was matching her pace. He was walking the high ground, keeping himself between her and the open wilderness. Tahan. The name floated into her mind, though she didn't know where she had heard it, perhaps a whisper in the wind, perhaps a memory of the gossip in town. He stayed with her, a silent, dark guardian against the bright, cruel sky, until the roofs of Dry Creek came into view. Only then did he turn his horse and disappear into the vastness of the Comanche, leaving Eliza to walk into the town of men with her empty hands and her shattered worldview. Eliza walked into Dry Creek with empty hands, but the town was so full of noise and fury that nobody noticed her lack of a basket. The air smelled of sweat, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of fear. It was noon, but the sun seemed to have paused directly overhead, turning the dusty street into an anvil where tempers were being hammered into something sharp and dangerous. Elias Pike stood on the raised boardwalk in front of his mercantile, looking like a preacher of doom. He had cleaned the dust from his suit, but his face was flushed with the heat and the intoxication of power. A crowd had gathered, ranchers who had lost stock, shopkeepers worried about their glass windows, and drifters looking for a cause that might pay in coin or violence. "We cannot wait for the government," Pike bellowed, waving a ledger in the air. "The government is days away. The savages are here now. They burned the Heart Barn last night. Who is next? Your store, your children's beds." The crowd rumbled, a low growl of agreement. Eliza stopped at the edge of the throng. Her heart was still pounding from the encounter at the river, her dress stained with mud and the yolk of broken eggs. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, watching these men discuss a war they did not understand. "I am putting up $500 of my own money," Pike announced, his voice booming, "to hire men, real men, men who know how to protect this town. We need a militia, friends. We need to secure our borders until we can drive this threat back into the Stone Age." Men were reaching into their pockets. Pike was not just selling safety. He was selling the right to be angry. He was buying their loyalty, coin by coin, turning the town into his private army. Eliza realized with a cold dread that this was how he would take the land. He would not need a bank foreclosure if he controlled the very law of the territory. Suddenly, a shout went up from the south end of the street. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. "They got one. The boys brought one in." A cloud of dust heralded the arrival of 4 riders. They were not soldiers, but rough men, mercenaries, and hired guns that Pike likely already had on his payroll. Dragged behind the lead horse, stumbling but moving with a defiant rhythm, was a prisoner. His hands were bound behind his back with raw hide. A rope around his neck was tethered to the saddle horn of the lead rider. He was covered in dust, and a bruise was darkening on his cheekbone, but his head was high. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was him. The paint horse was being led behind the group, its saddle empty. The warrior Tahan walked with a dignity that made the men on horseback look small. He did not look at the jeering crowd. He looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The leader of the raiding party. The lead rider shouted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the prisoner's shoulder. Caught him circling back toward the river, heavily armed, carrying a white man's rifle. "Hang him," someone screamed from the back. "String him up right now." Order. Deputy Sam Dyer stepped off the porch of the saloon, holding a shotgun. "We will have order here. Bring him into the saloon. We will hear this out. Justice will be done, but it will be done properly." The mob surged toward the saloon. Eliza was swept along with them, crushed between bodies smelling of manure and stale tobacco. She tried to pull back, to run, but her feet moved of their own accord. She had to see. She had to know. The interior of the Thirsty Mule Saloon was dim and stifling. The air was thick enough to chew. They shoved Tahan toward the bar, forcing him to his knees. Pike and Dyer took their places behind a poker table. transforming it into a makeshift judge's bench. The rest of the town packed in, standing on chairs, hanging off the staircase railing. "This man," Pike began, acting as prosecutor, judge, and jury all at once, "was found trespassing on civilized land. He is armed with stolen weaponry. We believe him to be the ringleader of the attacks on our livestock and the arsonist who destroyed the Hart property." He pointed a finger at Tahan. "What do you say to yourself? Boy, do you even speak a civilized tongue?" Tahan remained silent. His dark eyes swept the room, resting for a fleeting second on Eliza, who was pressed against the back wall. There was no plea for help in his gaze, only a calm recognition. "He speaks English fine," a voice called out. The big hunter from the river pushed his way to the front. He had cleaned the urine from his trousers, but the malice in his eyes was fresh. "I saw him," the hunter lied, grinning at the crowd. "Me and my boys. We were down by the river, tracking a deer. This buck jumped us, threatened to skin us alive. He was bragging about it, bragging about the fire at the Hart place." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie, a bold, terrible lie. "Did he say anything else?" Pike asked, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming. "Yeah," the hunter said, looking directly at Eliza across the room. "He asked about the white women in town. Said he was looking to—" The hunter paused for dramatic effect. "He said he was looking to go hunting the nest inside white girls." The room exploded. The men roared with outrage. The women gasped and clutched their shawls tighter. It was the ultimate trigger, the threat of violation. The hunter had taken his own vile threat, the one he had whispered to Eliza, and put it in the mouth of the Comanche to seal his death warrant. "That is enough," Dyer shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "We have a confession of intent arson, horse theft, and conspiracy to defile." Eliza stood frozen. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. If she stayed silent, the town would feel safe. Pike would get his victory. Her father would not be harassed. She could go home, keep her head down, and maybe, just maybe, survive the winter. But if she spoke, she would be marking herself. She would be the woman who defended a savage. She would be a traitor. She looked at Tahan. He was on his knees, surrounded by hate. Yet he looked more like a man than anyone else in the room. He had saved her life. Twice, he had respected her when her own people had tried to violate her. She'd heard her father's voice in her head. "I will keep my name clean." What was a name worth if it was wrapped in a lie? Liar. The word tore out of her throat, shrill and desperate. The room went silent. Heads turned. 100 pairs of eyes focused on Eliza Hart. She pushed off the wall, her legs trembling but her chin lifted. "He is lying. That man is a liar." Pike stood up, his face darkening. "Eliza, child, you are overwrought. You have lost your barn. You don't know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying." Eliza pushed through the crowd, walking until she stood between the mob and the kneeling prisoner. "This man, this Comanche, he did not brag about the fire. He wasn't even there." "And how would you know that, Miss Hart?" Dyer asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Because I was there at the river," Eliza said, her voice ringing clear now. "Those 3 men, those hunters, they cornered me. They knocked over my basket. They were the ones who threatened me." She pointed a shaking finger at the hunter. "He is the one who said it. He said, we could go hunting the nest inside this little hen. He was talking about raping me and this man." She gestured to Tahan. "He stopped them. He saved me, just like he saved Mr. Pike's wagon yesterday when the horses bolted." She turned to Pike. "Tell them." "Tell them he stopped your team on the Ridge Road. You saw him." Pike's face went from red to a pale, icy white. The room murmured. The narrative was cracking. A white woman accusing white men and defending an Indian. It was unheard of. Pike walked slowly around the table. He stopped in front of Eliza. He did not look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a wolf who had been cornered. "Eliza," he said softly, but his voice carried to the back of the room. "We all know you are eccentric. You live out there alone, no mother, a sick father. It is lonely." He turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. "Is it not possible that our dear Eliza is confused, or perhaps compromised?" He looked back at her, his eyes cruel. "You say he saved you twice. That is a lot of contact with a savage. Eliza, a lot of time spent in the brush." "I am telling the truth," Eliza cried. "Are you," Pike sneered, "or are you protecting a lover?" The crowd gasped. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "They call you the virgin with the egg basket," Pike said, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. "But maybe that basket has been overturned already. Maybe that nest isn't so untouched after all. Maybe you like the way a savage rides." The shame hit Eliza like a physical blow. Tears stung her eyes, hot and angry. He was taking her virtue, the one thing she had fought so hard to keep, and twisting it into a weapon to destroy her credibility. He was using the town's prejudice to paint her as a whore so he could hang an innocent man. The mob began to laugh. It was a cruel, jeering sound. Then, a voice cut through the laughter. It was deep, calm, and perfectly controlled. "I trade furs." Tahan stood up. The two men holding his shoulders tried to force him down, but he shook them off with a shrug of immense power. He stood tall, looking down at Pike. "I trade furs." Tahan repeated in clear English. "With the French, with the Texan. I sell horses. I will not steal them." The room went quiet again. The savage was speaking, and he sounded rational. "I did not burn the barn," Tahan said, his eyes locking onto Pike's. "But I have seen the men who did. They ride horses with government brands. They carry rifles that are new. Winchester 73s, like the ones in the crates behind your store." "Shopkeeper." Pike flinched. It was a microscopic movement, but Eliza saw it. Tahan saw it. "You sell whiskey to my people," Tahan continued, his voice steady. "You sell guns to the renegades who raid the South. You pay them to burn out the settlers so you can buy the land for pennies." "Shut him up," Pike shrieked, his composure shattering. "He is lying. He is a heathen liar." "I saw the crates," Tahan said, addressing the crowd now. "Marked for the fort, but sitting in his cellar. Ask him." Doubt rippled through the room. The ranchers looked at Pike. They knew Pike was greedy. They knew he was a snake. Was it possible Dyer saw the tide turning? He stepped in, racking the slide of his shotgun. "Enough," the deputy shouted. "We are not here to listen to the ramblings of a prisoner. We are here to keep the peace." He looked at Pike, and a silent message passed between them. They could not hang him now, not with Eliza's testimony and the doubt Tahan had sown. It would look too much like a cover-up. They needed time to fix this. "Lock him up," Dyer ordered. "We will hold him for the federal marshals. They are due in 3 days. Let them decide. If he is innocent, he goes. If he is guilty, he hangs." "He will escape," a man shouted. "Not in my jail." "He won't," Dyer spat. "Take him away." The men grabbed Tahan. He did not fight. He let them drag him toward the back door. But as he passed Eliza, he paused. He did not speak, but the look he gave her was searing. It was a look of gratitude, and something else. Recognition. She had stood for him. She had thrown her reputation into the fire to save him. As the door slammed shut, Pike turned to the crowd. "Drinks are on the house. We have the villain. The town is safe." The tension broke into forced celebration, but Eliza felt cold. She saw the look Pike gave her. It was a promise. She had made an enemy today, one who would not stop until she was destroyed. She pushed her way out of the saloon, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the eyes that undressed her and judged her. Indian lover, traitor, whore. She walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, but her mind was already on the night to come. Night fell over Dry Creek like a heavy curtain. The celebration in the saloon had died down to a dull roar. The street was empty. Eliza moved through the shadows behind the livery stable. She had gone home, gathered the last of the food. She had a loaf of cornbread and a jar of preserved peaches, and rode back under the cover of darkness. She told herself she was just bringing a prisoner a meal. Christian charity. That was all. But she knew it was a lie. She was going because she couldn't let him sit in the dark alone. She was going because he was the only person who had told the truth today. The jailhouse was a small stone building at the edge of town. A single lantern burned near the door. The deputy on duty was usually Old Man Cletus, a harmless drunk who slept more than he watched. Eliza crept closer, clutching the bundle of food. She expected to see Cletus dozing in the chair on the porch. The chair was empty. She frowned. She stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking softly under her boots. The door to the jail was ajar. Her heart leaped into her throat. She pushed the door open. Inside, the lantern on the desk was sputtering low. Cletus was there, but he wasn't sleeping. He was slumped over the desk, a nasty lump on the back of his head. He was breathing, a soft snore indicating he was unconscious, but alive. The keys were gone from the hook on the wall. Eliza turned to the single cell at the back of the room. The iron door stood wide open. The cell was empty. She stepped inside. The cot was undisturbed. On the stone floor, scratched into the dirt with a piece of straw or a fingernail, was a symbol, a circle with a line through it, a broken egg or a rising sun. She couldn't tell. A sound from outside made her freeze. It was the rhythmic drumming of hooves. Not a gallop, but a steady, ground-eating lope. It was fading, moving west, toward the river, toward the valley of the Comanche. He was gone. Eliza ran to the door and looked out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but she could feel the vibration of the horse in the soles of her feet. She should have felt relief. He was free. He wouldn't hang. But as she stood there, clutching the cornbread, she felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. Pike would not let this go. He would use the escape as proof of guilt. He would rally the town at dawn. They would ride out, not just to catch a prisoner, but to slaughter a tribe. And they would come to her farm next. She looked at the empty jail, then at the dark horizon where Tahan had vanished. She couldn't go back to the farm. If she went back, she was just waiting for Pike to come and take everything, waiting to be the victim. She remembered Tahan's voice. Fire is a coward's weapon. Eliza's heart dropped the cornbread. She ran to where she had tied a borrowed horse, her neighbor's old gelding she had taken without asking. She swung into the saddle, hiking her skirts up. She wasn't going to wait for the storm to hit. She was going to ride into the eye of it. She turned the horse's head west, following the fading sound of the paint horse. She was going to Comanche. She was going to warn him. And maybe, just maybe, she was going to find a way to save her land that didn't involve selling her soul to Elias Pike. The virgin with the egg basket was gone. The woman who rode into the darkness was something else entirely. The dawn broke over Dry Creek not with the promise of a new day, but with the threat of a coming reckoning. The sun was a pale, sickly yellow behind a veil of high, thin clouds, casting a diffused light that made the shadows stretch long and distorted. Eliza Hart had not ridden far the previous night. The borrowed gelding was old, and the darkness had been treacherous. She had doubled back to the only place she knew, risking everything for a few supplies before facing the wilderness. She lay flat on the roof of her root cellar, hidden by the tall, overgrown weeds that bordered her garden, her chest pressed against the cooling earth. Below her, near the charred remains of her barn, 2 horses stood stamping the ground. One belonged to Elias Pike. The other belonged to a man she did not know, a stranger with a long duster coat and a rifle scabbard heavily tooled in silver. "The town is in a frenzy." "Elias," the stranger said. His voice was like grinding stones. "You did good work with that jailbreak story. They're ready to shoot anything with copper skin." "It was necessary," Pike replied, his voice smooth and satisfied. He lit a cigar, the smoke drifting up to where Eliza held her breath. "That little scene in the saloon with the Hart girl nearly ruined the narrative. I had to accelerate the timeline. If the federal marshals arrive and find a peaceful town, the deal is off. And the land, the Hart girl is gone, ran off in the night, likely out of shame or fear," Pike said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I will foreclose on the 1st of the month. Once we clear the savages out of the valley, this entire sector from the creek to the canyon will be open range. The cattle syndicate in Chicago will pay $20,000 for the water rights alone." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was not about safety. It was not about justice for a burned barn. It was about water rights and Chicago money. Pike had orchestrated the raids, or at least facilitated them, to create a war that would wipe out the Comanche and displace her. All to sell the land to a cattle baron. "Make sure the boys find the Indian," the stranger said, mounting his horse. "And if the girl is with him, well, casualties of war. Elias, casualties of war." They rode off in opposite directions, Pike back toward town to rally his lynch mob, the stranger heading south. Eliza waited until the sound of hooves faded into the wind. She scrambled down from the cellar roof, her hands shaking. She ran to the coop. The hens were agitated, sensing the tension in the air. Mechanically, driven by a desperate need for normalcy in a world gone mad. Eliza gathered 24 eggs. She packed them into her last remaining willow basket, layering them with soft hay. It was a foolish thing to take into a war zone, perhaps, but it was her identity. It was the only currency she had ever known. If she was going to meet the Comanche, she would not go as a beggar. She would go as a trader. She mounted the old gelding, balancing the basket on her lap, and turned him west. She had to beat Pike's men to the canyon. She had to warn Tahan. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised purple. The air became heavy and static, making the hair on Eliza's arms stand up. The Texas plains were known for their violence, and a storm was brewing, one of those sudden, terrifying tempests that scoured the earth clean. The wind picked up, whipping grit and tumbleweeds across the trail. Eliza lowered her head, squinting against the stinging sand. The gelding pinned his ears back, fighting the bit. "Easy, boy," she murmured, though her own voice was lost in the rising howl of the gale. The first crack of thunder sounded like a cannon shot right beside her ear. A fork of lightning, jagged and blinding white, stabbed the earth not 50 yards ahead. The gelding screamed. He reared violently, twisting his body in midair. Eliza lost her stirrups. She was thrown backward, time seeming to slow as she fell. She hit the hard-packed earth with a bone-jarring thud that knocked the wind out of her. The basket flew from her hands. It hit a rock. The sound of crunching willow and shattering shells was tiny compared to the thunder. But to Eliza, it was deafening. She gasped for air, rolling onto her side. The gelding was gone, galloping back toward the safety of the flatlands. She was alone. Rain began to fall, not drops, but sheets of icy water mixed with hail. It slashed at her face, soaking her dress in seconds. She tried to stand, but her ankle gave way with a sharp spike of pain. "No!" she sobbed, the sound torn away by the wind. She dragged herself toward the broken basket. The eggs her offering, her pride, were a ruined mess of yellow yolk and white slime mixing with the red mud. Another flash of lightning lit up the world. In that split second of illumination, she saw him. He was not riding. He was running toward her, a dark shape cutting through the curtain of rain. Tahan. He reached her just as the next peal of thunder shook the ground. He didn't speak. There was no time. He scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she were a child. Eliza clung to his wet buckskin shirt, burying her face in his shoulder. He smelled of rain, sage, and wood smoke. He carried her up a steep incline, his moccasins finding purchase on the slick rocks where a horse would have slipped. He ducked low, pulling her into a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. It was a shallow cave, barely deep enough for 2 people, but it was dry. Tahan set her down gently at the back of the alcove, then turned to pull a heavy piece of canvas from a stash hidden near the entrance, likely a scout's emergency cache. He draped it over the opening, blocking out the worst of the wind and rain. The sudden silence in the small space was jarring. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Eliza shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Her dress was plastered to her skin, and the adrenaline was fading, leaving her cold and terrified. Tahan moved in the dim light. He knelt beside her, his movements economical and calm. He took a flint striker from his belt pouch. A small pile of dry kindling and moss sat in the center of the cave floor. He had prepared this place before. Sparks flew. A tiny flame caught, then grew, casting dancing shadows on the limestone walls. He looked at her then. His hair was wet, plastered to his skull, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. He looked dangerous, wild, and utterly safe. "You should not be here," he said. His voice was low, vibrating in the small space. "The storm kills the foolish. I came to warn you," Eliza stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Pike, he is coming, with men. They know you are in the valley." Tahan fed a stick to the fire. "I know. My scouts have seen them gathering. It is not just a raid." Eliza pushed on, her words tumbling out. "It is the land. They want the water. Pike and a man from the railroad. They are using the raids as an excuse to wipe you out, to sell the valley." Tahan paused. He looked at the fire, his expression darkening. "They always want the land. They eat the earth and leave only stones." He reached for a buffalo robe that was rolled up in the corner and wrapped it around Eliza's shoulders. His hands brushed her arms warm, rough and gentle. "Why did you come?" he asked, sitting back on his heels. "You stood for me in the town. That was dangerous. To come here is madness. I had nowhere else to go," Eliza whispered. "They burned my barn. They killed my hope, and I couldn't let them hang you for a lie." The fire crackled. Tahan looked at her, really looked at her, with a depth that made Eliza feel transparent. "I am not what they say I am," he said softly. "I am not a monster who hunts women in the dark." "I know," Eliza said. "My father was a chief of the Penateca band," Tahan said, staring into the flames. "He believed we could live alongside the Texans. He sent me to the trading posts when I was a boy. I learned your tongue. I learned to read your contracts. I thought words could be a shield." He laughed bitterly. "I was a guide for a survey team 2 years ago. I showed them the water holes. I showed them the passes. When the map was finished, they shot my horse and left me in the desert without water. They said an Indian who knows the land is useful, but an Indian who knows the map is a threat." Eliza reached out, her hand hovering near his arm. "They betrayed you." "They taught me," Tahan corrected. "They taught me that a piece of paper is stronger than a spear, and a lie travels faster than a horse." Eliza looked down at her hands, still stained with the mud of her fall. "That man, the hunter at the river, what he said about hunting the nest." She shuddered. The memory of the crude words made her feel dirty. "I hate that they look at me and see only something to be broken, something to be taken. They call me the virgin, like I'm a piece of fruit waiting to rot if not eaten. It makes me feel small." Tahan shifted. He moved closer to her, invading her personal space, but in a way that felt like he was building a wall between her and the world, not trapping her. "Words have the power you give them," he said. He spoke in Comanche first, a fluid, rolling sentence, then translated. "Sena, it means nest in my tongue, but it does not mean a place to hide. It is the center. It is where life begins. It is where the eagle brings food. It is the strongest place on the mountain." He looked into her eyes, his gaze intense. "To hunt a nest is to destroy the future. Only a coyote does this. A man protects the nest. He stands before it and dies before he lets the storm inside." Eliza's breath hitched. He was rewriting the insult. He was taking the ugliest thing that had been thrown at her and turning it into a shield. "I am not a coyote," Tahan whispered. He reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His skin was warm against her cold cheek. "You are shaking," he murmured. "I am not cold anymore," Eliza whispered. He leaned in. He did not grab her. He did not loom over her. He moved slowly, giving her every second to pull away. He brought his forehead to rest against hers. It was a gesture of immense intimacy, a sharing of breath and thought. Eliza closed her eyes. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart, the heat radiating from his chest. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like prey. She felt seen. Then, He tilted his head slightly. He kissed her forehead, a soft pressure that felt like a benediction. Then his lips moved down to the bridge of her nose, and finally, to her mouth. It was not the hungry, devouring kiss she had feared from men like Pike. It was slow. It was a question. "May I?" Eliza let out a shaky breath and leaned into him. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the hard muscle beneath the buckskin. She pressed back, answering the question. Yes. His lips were firm and warm. The kiss deepened, tasting of rain and smoke and longing. It was a kiss that bridged two worlds. A silent treaty signed in the flicker of firelight. It was the Comanche's kiss, wild but disciplined, fierce but tender. They broke apart slowly, their foreheads still touching. Eliza's heart was racing, but it was in a good rhythm now. A strong rhythm. "You stayed," Tahan whispered, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "I chose," Eliza corrected him. "I chose to stay." They sat there for a long time as the storm raged outside, the thunder muffled by the stone walls. They did not do more than kiss, the weight of the moment, the danger waiting for them at dawn, and the respect Tahan held for her forbade it. But in that cave, something fundamental shifted. Eliza Hart was no longer just the girl protecting a farm. She was a woman who had found an ally. Toward morning, the wind died down, the rain stopped, the sun began to creep over the horizon, painting the wet rocks in shades of pink and gold. Tahan stood up and pulled down the canvas. The air was crisp and clean. Eliza stepped out of the cave. Her body ached, but her mind was clear. She looked down at the base of the slope where she had fallen. The basket lay on its side. The eggs were gone, washed away or eaten by scavengers in the night. The willow frame was crushed. She stared at it, a wave of sadness washing over her. "My eggs, I have nothing left to trade. I have nothing to give your elders." Tahan stepped up beside her. He looked at the broken basket. Then he turned to look at Eliza. He saw the set of her jaw. He saw the fire in her blue eyes that the storm had not extinguished. "They said they were hunting the nest inside you," Tahan said, his voice deep and resonant in the morning air. He shook his head slightly, a small, proud smile touching his lips. "They were wrong. You carry a different kind of nest." Eliza looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You carry courage," he said. "You carry honor. That is the nest where a new life can grow. That is what you bring to my people." He offered her his hand. It was a large hand, scarred from battles and hard work, but open. "Come, my village is half a day's ride. We will go to the elders. You will tell them what you heard about the railroad man. And then," his eyes turned hard, looking back toward the east, toward Dry Creek. "Then we will stop running. We will make Elias Pike choke on his own lies." Eliza took his hand. Her grip was firm. She looked at the broken basket one last time, then turned her back on it. She didn't need it anymore. She wasn't the virgin with the egg basket. She was Eliza Hart, and she was riding into war. "Let's go," she said. Tahan whistled. From the brush below, the paint horse emerged, shaking water from its coat. Tahan swung up, then pulled Eliza up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his back. As the horse sprang forward, climbing the ridge toward the heart of the Comancheria, Eliza felt a strange sensation. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of losing her home. She was busy finding it. The ride into the heart of the Comancheria was a journey through a world that felt both ancient and dangerously alive. The red rocks rose like the backbones of sleeping giants, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Eliza Hart sat behind Tahan, her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling the steady rhythm of the paint horse beneath them. She was exhausted, battered by the storm and the betrayal of her own people. Yet a strange clarity had settled over her. She was crossing a line on a map that she had been told never to cross. And with every hoofbeat, the town of Dry Creek felt smaller, like a bad dream fading in the morning light. When they crested the final ridge, the camp spread out below them in a sheltered bowl of the valley. Teepees made of buffalo hide stood in a circle. smoke curling lazily from their peaks. Dogs barked, and children stopped their games to stare at the riders. As they descended, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to hostility. Warriors, their faces painted with the black and red of war, stepped forward, bows drawn and rifles lowered. They spoke sharply to Tahan, their eyes flicking to Eliza with open suspicion. To them, she was not a guest. She was a spy, a symbol of the encroachment that was starving their children. Tahan raised a hand, speaking calmly in his native tongue, but the tension was a drawn bowstring. A young warrior with a scar running through his eyebrow stepped forward, grabbing the bridle of Tahan's horse and shouting something that sounded like an accusation. Eliza stiffened, but she did not look down. She remembered Tahan's words about the nest. She sat tall, meeting the glare of the young warrior. An old woman emerged from one of the larger lodges. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a river cutting through stone. Her hair was white braids, and her face was a map of deep lines etched by the sun and years of survival. She wore a dress of soft deerskin, adorned with elk teeth. This was Look's far woman, the clan mother and, as Eliza would learn, Tahan's grandmother. The camp went silent as she approached. She ignored Tahan and walked straight to the side of the horse where Eliza's leg hung. Her dark, milky eyes narrowed as she inspected Eliza's ruined dress. The calico fabric was stiff with dried mud and the yellow residue of the smashed eggs. It was a mess, a stain of failure. But the old woman reached out a withered hand and touched the crust of the yolk and the tiny fragments of shell still clinging to the cloth. She looked up at Eliza, then spoke a single sentence in a voice that sounded like dry leaves. Tahan dismounted and helped Eliza down. He looked at his grandmother, then at Eliza. "She says you carry the sun on your dress." Tahan translated, his voice quiet. "She sees the broken shell. To my people. The egg is the beginning, but the shell must break for life to come out. She says you have broken your covering, and now you are real." The hostility in the circle did not vanish, but it changed flavor. It went from the hatred of an enemy to the wariness of a stranger. Look's far woman gestured for them to follow. Inside the lodge, the air was cool and smelled of sweetgrass. Tahan spoke rapidly to the elders gathered there, 3 men with faces like carved wood and eyes that had seen too much blood. He told them of the fire, the false accusation, and the army of mercenaries Pike was gathering. Then he produced the leather satchel. It was a heavy, expensive thing, tooled with silver. Tahan had cut it from Pike's saddle during the chaos of the wagon rescue days before, almost as an afterthought, a trophy of the man who had tried to run him down. He had never opened it, regarding it as useless white man's baggage. "Open it," Eliza said, her voice trembling slightly. Tahan unbuckled the straps. Inside were ledgers and a thick sheaf of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Eliza pulled them out, her hands shaking as she smoothed the pages near the firelight. She read, and her blood turned to ice. "It is a contract," she whispered. "Not just for the land. It is for the water." She looked up at Tahan and the elders. "Elias Pike has already sold this valley. He sold it to a syndicate in Chicago 3 months ago. The contract says he guarantees clear title and removal of all hostile elements by the 1st of October. That is next week." She flipped to another page. "And here, this is a bill of sale for rifles. Winchester repeaters, bought by Pike, but delivered to a man named Red Jacks, the leader of the renegades." Tahan's face hardened into a mask of fury. "He pays men to burn your farms, then blames us so he can kill us and take the water. He is playing both sides," Eliza said, her voice rising with anger. "He is creating a war to make a profit." Tahan stood up. "Then we will give him a war. We will ride to the canyon. We will ambush them before they reach the valley floor. We will kill them all." "No," Eliza said. The word hung in the air. The elders looked at her. A white woman telling a war chief no was a dangerous thing. "If you kill them," Eliza said, standing up to face him, "the army will come. If you wipe out Pike and his men, the newspapers in the East will call it a massacre. They will send 1,000 soldiers. You will lose the valley forever." "Then what do you suggest?" Tahan asked, his eyes flashing. "Do we let them shoot us?" "We trap them," Eliza said. "We caught Pike. We make him confess. We show these papers to the men he lied to. Half of that posse are just scared farmers. If they know Pike burned their barns, they will turn on him." "And who will read the papers to them?" Tahan asked. "They will not listen to a Comanche." "I will," Eliza said. "I will ride with you." The elders murmured in protest. Tahan shook his head. "It is too dangerous. Bullets do not know you are innocent." "I am the only one who can read the proof," Eliza insisted. She grabbed his arm, ignoring the shock of the others. "You said I carry a nest of courage. Let me show you. I am not staying behind to be safe. I am fighting for my home too." Tahan looked at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. He saw the steel there. He nodded slowly. "We ride at noon." The canyon was a jagged scar in the earth, a narrow pass where the walls rose 300 feet on either side. It was a place of shadows and echoes, perfect for an ambush. By late afternoon, the heat was suffocating. Tahan had positioned his warriors high on the rim and behind the boulders that littered the canyon floor. They were invisible, part of the stone. Eliza crouched behind a large outcrop of sandstone near the narrowest part of the pass. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched the leather satchel to her chest. Then they heard it. The sound of iron shoes on stone, the jingle of bits, the voices of men. Pike's column rode into view. It was a ragged army. At the front rode Elias Pike, looking regal on a white stallion, a heavy pistol on his hip. Beside him was Deputy Dyer, sweating and nervous. Behind them were 30 men, some hardened mercenaries, but many just boys from Dry Creek, armed with rusty shotguns and fueled by Pike's whiskey and lies. Among them, riding slightly apart, was a young cavalry lieutenant in a blue uniform. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the cliffs. He was the observer Dyer had mentioned, the token of federal authority Pike needed to legitimize the slaughter. "Keep your eyes sharp," Pike shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "They are cowards. They will hide in the rocks." "We should turn back, Elias," the lieutenant said. "This is a choke point. If they are here, we are sitting ducks." "Nonsense," Pike scoffed. "They are running. We will burn their village by sundown." Tahan let them ride until the entire column was inside the trap. Then he gave a signal, the sharp cry of a red-tailed hawk. The canyon exploded, not with bullets, but with arrows. They did not aim for the men. They aimed for the ground in front of the horses. Hundreds of arrows struck the earth with a terrifying thwack, creating a sudden fence of quivering shafts. The horses panicked. Pike's stallion reared, nearly throwing him. The column dissolved into chaos, animals screaming and spinning, men shouting and struggling to keep their seats. Ambush. Fire at will," Dyer screamed, blasting his shotgun uselessly at the cliffs. A few mercenaries returned fire, their bullets chipping stone high above, but they had no targets. The Comanche were ghosts. Then Tahan stepped out from behind a boulder, 20 yards in front of Pike. He held no weapon, only his arms spread wide. "Hold!" the young lieutenant shouted, seeing the unarmed man. "Hold your fire!" The confusion caused a momentary lull. In that silence, Tahan spoke, his voice booming. "You hunt a ghost, Elias Pike, but the ghost has teeth. Kill him!" Pike shrieked, struggling with his horse. "Shoot him down!" "Wait!" Eliza stepped out from the shadows. She walked into the open, the sunlight catching the white flag she had tied to a piece of driftwood. She stood beside Tahan, a woman in a ruined dress standing next to a warrior in war paint. The men of Dry Creek lowered their guns in shock. "Eliza," one of the farmers called out. "Eliza Hart. We thought you were dead." "I am not dead," Eliza yelled, her voice scraping raw against her throat. "But I would be if I had waited for Elias Pike to protect me." She held up the satchel. "I have the proof. I have the papers from Pike's own wagon." "She is lying," Pike roared, his face turning a mottled purple. "She is mad. The savage has bewitched her. Shoot them both." "Anyone who shoots answers to the United States Army," the lieutenant shouted. Drawing his saber and forcing his horse between Pike and Eliza, he looked at Eliza. "What papers, ma'am?" Eliza walked forward, her legs trembling but her steps sure. She opened the oilcloth. "This is a contract of sale," she shouted, turning so the farmers could hear. "Dated 3 months ago. Elias Pike sold the water rights to the canyon to the Chicago Cattle Syndicate. He got paid $5,000. A murmur went through the crowd. $5,000 was a fortune. "And this," she pulled out the second paper, "is a receipt for 50 Winchester rifles delivered to the renegade Red Jack. The same rifles that burned my barn, the same rifles that attacked your wagons." She looked directly at the farmer who had called out to her. "Mr. Henderson Pike told you Comanches burned your hay, but here is a letter where Pike tells Red Jack to make sure the Henderson place burns so he will sell cheap." "That is a lie," Pike screamed. He drew his pistol. "I will not listen to this. This whore." He leveled the gun at Eliza. Tahan moved faster than thought. He launched himself forward, tackling Pike off his horse. The two men hit the dust with a heavy thud. Pike's gun went off, the bullet kicking up dirt inches from Eliza's foot. The mercenaries raised their rifles, but the warriors on the rim stood up. Hundreds of them, arrows drawn and aimed. It was a checkmate. On the ground, Pike and Tahan grappled. Pike was heavy, but Tahan was iron and wire. He wrenched the pistol from Pike's hand and pinned him to the earth. Tahan drew his knife, the blade flashing in the sun. He pressed the tip against Pike's throat. "Get off him!" Dyer yelled. The deputy raised his shotgun, aiming at Tahan's back. "I will kill you, Indian." Dyer's finger tightened on the trigger. Eliza threw herself in front of the deputy's gun. "No." Dyer froze. He couldn't shoot a white woman? "If you shoot him," Eliza hissed, staring into Dyer's sweaty face, "you prove everything I just said. You prove you are Pike's dog." The lieutenant rode up and kicked the shotgun out of Dyer's hands. "You are under arrest, deputy," he said coldly. "Stand down." On the ground, Tahan had Pike at his mercy. Pike was wheezing, his eyes bulging with terror. A thin line of blood appeared where the knife pressed against his skin. Tahan's arm was shaking with the effort of holding back. This was the man who had demonized his people. This was the man who wanted to erase them. "Do it!" Pike gasped, trying to goad him. "Kill me! Show them you are a savage!" Tahan roared, raising the knife high. "Tahan! No!" Eliza screamed. She dropped to her knees beside them. She grabbed Tahan's wrist. Her hands were small against his muscular forearm, but her grip was desperate. "Don't!" she pleaded. "If you kill him now, they will forget the papers. They will forget the fire. They will only remember that an Indian killed a white man. Don't give him that victory. Let him live to see his name destroyed." Tahan looked at Pike, then at the knife, and finally at Eliza. His chest heaved. The rage was afire in his blood, demanding payment. But he looked into Eliza's eyes and saw the truth there. She was right. Death was too easy for Elias Pike. Tahan slowly lowered the knife. He leaned close to Pike's ear. "You are not worth my blade." Tahan whispered, "You are nothing." He stood up, spitting on the ground next to Pike's head. Two soldiers dismounted and hauled Pike to his feet. The merchant was trembling, stripped of his power, stripped of his dignity. The farmers of Dry Creek looked at him with disgust. They saw the monster now, and it wasn't the man with the painted face. "Secure them," the lieutenant ordered, pointing to Pike and Dyer. "We will take them to the federal court in Austin. Miss Hart, I will need those papers as evidence." Eliza handed the satchel to the officer. "Take them. Take them all away." The tension in the canyon broke. The warriors on the rim lowered their bows. The farmers lowered their guns. The silence that followed was not the silence of death, but the silence of a storm that had miraculously passed. Tahan stood alone in the center of the road. His hands were stained with the dust of the fight and a smear of Pike's blood from the shallow cut. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at Eliza. He had spent his life fighting. He had thought the only way to survive was to be sharper, faster, deadlier. But today, A woman with a broken egg basket and a piece of paper had won a victory his knife never could. He walked over to her. He didn't care about the soldiers or the staring townsfolk. He dropped to one knee, not in submission, but to bring his eyes level with hers as she sat on the rock, exhausted. "You stopped the storm," he said quietly. "We stopped it," Eliza corrected him. She reached out and took his hand, wiping the dust from his knuckles with her thumb. Tahan looked at the white men leading Pike away in chains. He realized that the world had changed. The old way of the arrow was fading. A new fight was beginning, a fight of laws, of words, of standing your ground not just with a weapon, but with the truth. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he did not want to fight this new battle alone. He squeezed Eliza's hand. "The nest is safe," he whispered. Eliza managed a tired, watery smile. For now. Above them, the hawk cried out again, circling the canyon, watching the two small figures standing together amidst the settling dust of history. The dust from the canyon ambush had settled, but the silence that descended upon Dry Creek was heavier than the heat of the noonday sun. It was a silence born of shock, the kind that follows a sudden, violent shift in the way the world is understood. The town, once a cauldron of paranoid whispers and misplaced aggression, now looked like a place that had woken up from a fever dream to find itself stained with shame. 2 days had passed since the confrontation in the canyon. The federal transport wagon sat in front of the jailhouse, its iron-barred windows gleaming dully. Inside sat Elias Pike and Sam Dyer. Pike, stripped of his fine linen suit and his terrifying influence, looked small. He sat slumped in the corner, staring at the floorboards, muttering about contracts and ungrateful peasants. Dyer, the man who had worn the tin star as a license to bully, gripped the bars with white knuckles, watching the town he used to rule turn its back on him. Eliza Hart stood on the boardwalk across the street, watching the transfer. She wore a borrowed dress, simple and gray, but she stood with a posture that made the fabric look like armor. Beside her stood Tahan. He had washed the war paint from his face, revealing the sharp, handsome planes of his features. But he still wore his buckskins and the eagle feather in his hair. Nobody shouted at them, nobody jeered. The people of Dry Creek, the shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the wives who had clutched their children in fear of savages, now watched with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. They had been ready to kill this man. They had been ready to stone this woman. And it turned out that the monsters were the men they had elected and enriched. "It is a strange thing," Tahan said softly, his voice barely carrying over the wind, "to see a wolf put in a cage by the sheep." "They aren't sheep," Eliza replied, watching the young Lieutenant Miller lock the transport door. "They were just blind. Pike kept them in the dark so he could pick their pockets." Lieutenant Miller walked over to them, tipping his hat. He looked exhausted, but satisfied. "We are moving them to Austin for the federal inquiry. Miss Hart, your testimony and those ledgers will put Pike away for 20 years. Attempted murder, inciting a riot, fraud. The list is long." "And the land?" Eliza asked. "The contract with the Chicago Syndicate is void," Miller assured her. "Pike had no right to sell land he didn't own. The valley remains, contested, but safe for now." He looked at Tahan. "We have set up a meeting at the church. The Reverend, Mr. Henderson, and a few of the other ranchers want to speak with you. About boundaries, about the herds." Tahan nodded slowly. "I will come, but I bring my own witnesses. The days of signing papers in the dark are over." The meeting in the white-steepled church was a tableau of the new reality. On one side of the oak table sat the pillars of Dry Creek society, Reverend Thomas, nervous and wiping his spectacles, John Henderson, the rancher whose barn Pike had ordered burned, and Lieutenant Miller, representing the law. On the other side sat Tahan and 2 elders from his band who had ridden in that morning. Eliza sat at the end of the table, not quite on either side, acting as the bridge. The air was stiff with the scent of old hymn books and fresh tension. These were men who had shot at each other 3 days ago. Now, they were trying to share a map. "We cannot have the hunting parties coming this close to the creek," Henderson said, his voice gruff but lacking its former hostility. My cattle got spooked. The calves get separated. Your cattle eat the grass my horses need for winter, Tahan countered, his English measured and calm. You put up wire that cuts the legs of the buffalo. If you want us to stay away from the creek, you must pull down the fences on the north ridge. It was a negotiation of inches, of grass and water, but it was happening with words, not Winchesters, Eliza translated when the meaning got lost, smoothing the edges of the anger, reminding them of the common enemy they had just defeated. We both bleed the same, Eliza said during a particularly heated moment about grazing rights. Pike wanted us to kill each other so he could take it all. If we fight now, we're just doing his work for him for free. The room went quiet. Henderson looked at his calloused hands, then nodded. She is right. We share the water, or we all die of thirst. By the time the sun began to dip, a tentative agreement had been reached. It was not a perfect peace, but it was a start. A handshake between Henderson and Tahan hesitant. Quick, but real sealed it. Eliza left the church feeling a weight lift from her shoulders, only to have a different one settle in its place. She walked back to the farm, Tahan riding silently beside her. The farmhouse was quiet. The charred ruins of the barn were a black scar on the landscape, but the house still stood. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sickness. Dr. Evans was packing his bag by the door. He looked at Eliza with sad, kind eyes. I have done what I can. Eliza, the consumption. It has taken a hard hold. He doesn't have much time, maybe a month, maybe less. Eliza nodded, feeling a numbness spread through her chest. She walked into the bedroom. Jeremiah Hart lay propped up on pillows, his face gaunt, his skin the color of old parchment. But his eyes were clear, cleared of the fever and the fear that had plagued him for months.
Eliza,
he rasped, reaching out a trembling hand. She took it, sitting on the edge of the bed.
I am here, Pa. Pike is gone. The debt with Pike is gone. The bank will work with us.
Jeremiah squeezed her hand with surprising strength.
Stop it, girl.
Stop what?
Stop trying to save a ghost,
he whispered. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook his thin frame.
I heard what you did, riding into the canyon, standing in front of a gun. You are more manly than I ever was these last 10 years. I did it for the farm. Pa, did you?
Jeremiah looked at her, his eyes searching her face. Or did you do it because you finally found something worth fighting for? And I don't mean this pile of dirt. He gestured weakly to the window, where Tahan was watering the horses at the trough.
He is out there. Isn't he the Comanche?
He is, Eliza said.
He saved me. Pa.
I know. Jeremiah sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. Listen to me, Eliza, this land. It killed your mother with work. It is killing me with dust. Do not let it kill you with duty. He opened his eyes, and they were wet with tears. You have been carrying this family like that basket of eggs you were so proud of, walking on eggshells, afraid to break, afraid to live. Well, the basket is broken now, Eliza, and you are still standing. I don't know what to do, Eliza confessed, her voice cracking. This is my home. Home is not soil, Jeremiah said firmly. Home is where you don't have to be afraid. If that is here, stay. But if it is out there, with him, or anywhere else, you go. When I pass, you sell this place. You take the money and you build a life that fits you. Do not become a ghost in this house just to keep me company. Eliza kissed his forehead, her tears falling onto his dry skin. He had given her the one thing she hadn't realized she needed permission to leave. The next evening, Eliza went into town to sign the final witness statements for the lieutenant. She walked down the main street, and the change in the atmosphere was palpable. Before, she had been the virgin with the egg basket, a walking punchline, a target for crude jokes. Now, as she passed the general store, Mrs. Miller came out, wiping her hands on her apron. Eliza, the older woman said, stopping her.
We heard about what you said to Dyer, about standing in front of the gun. Mrs. Miller looked down, then back up, her eyes wet. My husband was in that position. If you hadn't stopped them, if a war had started, he might not have come home. Thank you. Other women nodded as she passed. They didn't envy her purity anymore. They respected her steel. She wasn't a symbol of fragile virtue. She was the woman who had said no to the most powerful men in the territory when everyone else had said yes. Eliza entered the saloon to meet the lieutenant. It was a bold move. Respectable women didn't go into the saloon, but Eliza was done with the rules of Dry Creek. Tahan was with her, standing like a sentinel at her shoulder. The room went quiet as they entered. The piano player stopped mid-tune. Men looked into their beers. They moved to the table where Lieutenant Miller sat. As they passed the bar, a man turned around. It was the big hunter from the river, the one who had first made the threat, the one who had lied at the trial. He was drunk, his courage bolstered by whiskey. He looked at Eliza, then at Tahan, and a sneer curled his lip. He couldn't let it go. His pride was too wounded. Well, the hunter slurred, loud enough for the room to hear. If it isn't a happy couple, tell me, Chief, did you finally get to go hunting the nest inside her, or is she still play-acting like a lady? The room froze. The air turned jagged. This was the spark that could reignite the violence. Lieutenant Miller started to stand up, his hand going to his pistol. But Tahan moved first. He didn't draw his knife. He didn't strike the man. He didn't shout. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between the hunter and Eliza. He looked at the man with a calmness that was far more terrifying than any rage. It was the look of a mountain looking at a pebble. Then, Tahan reached out and placed his hand gently on Eliza's shoulder. It was a claim, a protection, and a statement of absolute solidarity. The only nest we hunt now, Tahan said, his voice deep and filling the silent room, is a home we choose together. He held the hunter's gaze until the man blinked, swallowed hard, and turned back to his drink, shrinking into himself. The silence in the saloon changed. It wasn't fearful anymore. It was respectful. Tahan had redefined the insult. He had taken the crude metaphor of the nest as a sexual conquest and turned it into something sacred, a home, a future, a choice. Eliza felt the warmth of his hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a Comanche warrior or a savior. She saw a partner. They walked out of the saloon, leaving the stunned silence behind them. They rode out to the ridge overlooking the town as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bands of violet and burnt orange. The air was cooling, the wind rustling the dry grass. They dismounted and let the horses graze. Tahan stood looking west, toward the red hills of his ancestors. The council went well, Tahan said. But it is only paper. Paper rots. People forget. He turned to Eliza. I'm going back to the valley tomorrow. My people need to rebuild before the winter. We need to move the camp to the southern canyon, away from the new fences. He paused, searching her face. Come with me. Eliza's breath hitched. Go with you to the village. The hills are red in the morning there, Tahan said softly. The wind smells of cedar, not cattle dust. You would be free. Eliza, no debts, no whispers in the town. He stepped closer, taking her hands. I do not promise it will be easy. The winters are hard, and there are many who will not accept a white woman among the lodges. But I promise you this, I will stand between you and the world. I will be the bridge. I will not let the two worlds crush you. It was a proposal, as clear and honest as the man himself. He was offering her the freedom she had craved for years. He was offering her a life where she was judged by her strength, not her basket. Eliza looked at the western horizon. It called to her. The idea of riding away, of disappearing into the wilderness with Tahan, was a siren song. But then she looked back at the town, the small lights flickering on in the windows. She thought of her father, coughing in the cabin. She thought of Mrs. Miller thanking her. She thought of the women who had looked at her with new hope. If she left, she was just running away again. If she became fully Comanche, she would be as lost to her own people as she had been when she was the virgin.
She realized with a sudden jolt that she didn't want to be just white or just Comanche. She had seen the worst and best of both. She was the woman who had carried the eggs and the woman who had carried the treaty. She squeezed Tahan's hands. "I cannot go. Not yet." Tahan's face fell slightly, though he tried to hide it. "You choose the town after everything they did." "No," Eliza said firmly. "I choose neither, and I choose both." She pulled her hands away and pointed to a spot in the valley below, exactly halfway between the last fence of the Dry Creek ranches and the first ridge of the Comanche. It was a grove of cottonwoods near the creek, neutral ground. "My father told me to find a home where I don't have to be afraid," Eliza said, her voice building with excitement. "If I go with you, I will hide from my people. If I stay here, I will hide from you. I don't want to hide anymore. Tahan," she looked at him, her blue eyes shining, "I want to build a trading post. Right there. In the middle." Tahan looked at the spot, then back at her, intrigued. "A post. A place where your women can bring their furs, their beadwork, their herbs," Eliza explained rapidly. "And the women from town can bring their clothes, their flour, their eggs. A place where they have to look at each other, where they have to talk to trade." She moved a step closer to him. "Pike wanted a war because war makes money for men. I want a trade because trade makes friends for women. I will run it. I will speak both tongues. I will be the bridge you talked about." Tahan stared at her. He saw the vision in her eyes. It was not a romantic escape. It was a strategic construction. It was a nest that wasn't hidden in a cave or locked in a house, but built in the open for everyone to see. A slow smile spread across his face. It was a smile of immense pride. "You are not a hen," he chuckled softly. "You are a hawk. You build your nest where the wind blows hardest." "Will you help me?" Eliza asked. "I cannot do it alone. I need you to bring your people. I need you to trust me." "I would trust you with my life," Tahan said seriously. "I have already done so." He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I will go to the village. I will tell the elders, and when the moon is full, I will bring the first furs. We will build this place. Eliza Hart." "Eliza," she corrected him softly. "Just Eliza. The name is enough now." "Just Eliza," he repeated, tasting the name. They stood there as the last light faded, two silhouettes against the vast, darkening prairie. They were not touching, not kissing, but the space between them was electric with a shared purpose. Eliza looked back at Dry Creek one last time. She wasn't trapped between the two worlds anymore. She was the stitch that was going to hold them together. "Go to your father," Tahan said, stepping back and mounting his horse. "Tell him you have found your place." "I will," Eliza said. "Ride safe, Tahan." He wheeled the paint horse around. "I do not ride for safety, Eliza. I ride for the future." He kicked the horse into a gallop, disappearing into the shadows of the west. Eliza watched him go, her heart aching with the separation but swelling with the promise of his return. She turned Bess, her father's old mare she had retrieved from the livery, toward the farm. She had a lot of work to do. She had a father to comfort, a farm to sell, and a trading post to build. The virgin with the egg basket was a story for the past. The woman who built the bridge was the story for the future. The winter snows had melted early that year, feeding the creek until it sang a boisterous, rushing song against the banks. 6 months had passed since the trial of Elias Pike and the confrontation in the canyon, and the landscape of the territory had changed not just geographically, but in the very soul of the people who lived there, where the old Buffalo Trail crossed the main wagon road, exactly halfway between the last fence of the Dry Creek ranches and the first red ridge of the Comanche. A new structure had risen from the earth. It was not a fortress of stone designed to repel arrows, nor was it a shanty of scrap wood. It was a sturdy, sprawling building made of hewn cedar logs and limestone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade from the Texas sun. Above the double doors swung a sign, freshly painted and creaking gently in the breeze. It did not bear a man's name or a claim of ownership. Instead, It featured a painting, a woven willow basket filled with eggs, crossed with a bundle of eagle feathers. Below the image, written in bold black letters, were words in 2 languages. On the left, the crossing. On the right, the Comanche symbols for the meeting place. Inside, the air was a rich tapestry of scents: roasted coffee beans, curing buckskin, dried sage, and fresh baked bread. The sunlight streamed through the clean glass windows, illuminating a scene that would have been unthinkable a year ago. At a long table near the back, Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife, was inspecting a pair of moccasins intricately beaded with patterns of blue and silver. Standing opposite her was Little Bird, a Comanche woman who had once been feared as a savage ghost. "The stitching is tight," Mrs. Miller said, running her thumb over the beadwork. "Will it hold against the mud?" Eliza Hart stood between them, her hands resting on the counter. She wore a dress of practical blue calico, but around her waist was a sash of woven red wool, a gift from the tribe. "It is sinew, Mrs. Miller," Eliza translated, smiling. "Little Bird says it will outlast the leather itself. She asks if the butter you brought is salted heavily. Her husband has a taste for salt." "Heavily salted?" Mrs. Miller nodded, pushing a crock of yellow butter across the table. "And tell her I have 3 yards of flannel coming next week if she has more of that healing balm for joints. My husband's back is giving him grief." Little Bird smiled, a flash of white teeth in a sun-darkened face, and slid the moccasins across. The trade was made. No money changed hands, only value for value, respect for respect. This was the daily rhythm of the place, now known throughout the territory simply as Eliza's Nest. The name had started as a whisper, a reclaiming of the old insult. But now it was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for churches. It was a sanctuary, a neutral ground where the men left their guns at the door and the women wove the fabric of a community that defied the mapmakers. Eliza moved through the room, checking inventory, settling disputes over the value of a fox pelt versus a sack of sugar, and pouring coffee. She was tired. Her feet ached, but her eyes were bright. She was no longer the frightened girl clutching a basket as a shield. She was the matriarch of a new world. Through the open back door, she could hear laughter. She walked to the frame and looked out. Behind the trading post, a garden had been planted. It was a chaotic, beautiful mix of rose, corn, and squash growing alongside neat beds of radishes and carrots. In the center of the garden, a group of children sat in a circle in the dirt. Some were the children of ranchers, with hair the color of straw. Others were Comanche children with hair like raven wings. In the middle of the circle sat Tahan. He was demonstrating how to read the weather in the clouds. He pointed a long, scarred finger at a wispy formation drifting high above the mountains. "See the tail?" Tahan asked in English, his voice a low rumble that made the children lean in. "When the cloud looks like a mare's tail sweeping the sky, the wind will come from the north tomorrow. It brings the cold. The rabbits will go deep. We must cover the young plants." A little boy from town raised his hand. "Does it mean snow, Mr. Tahan?" "Maybe," Tahan smiled. "Or maybe just a frost that bites your nose." He picked up a handful of dirt. "Now, look here. Who can tell me what walked here this morning?" He showed them a faint depression in the soil. The children scrambled over each other to look, their differences forgotten in the thrill of the puzzle. Eliza watched him, a lump forming in her throat. The warrior, who had once thrown a knife to stop a rape, was now teaching a rancher's son how to track a field mouse. He looked up, sensing her gaze. His dark eyes locked with hers, and the connection between them was a physical pull, stronger than gravity. Later that afternoon, when the last wagon had rumbled away toward town and the last pony had trotted west toward the hills, the trading post grew quiet. The sun began its descent, painting the prairie in bruised purples and blazing oranges. Eliza was wiping down the counter when Tahan entered. He carried the scent of the outdoors wind and earth. He walked up to her, not stopping until he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "The trade was good today," he said softly. "Better than good," Eliza replied,
resting her cloth on the wood. "We have enough flour to last the village through the first snows, and Mrs. Henderson brought enough wool to make blankets for every elder. You have built a strong house." "Eliza," Tahan said. "We built it," she corrected him. "Come," he said, taking her hand. "The sun is hitting the ridge. I have something to show you." He led her out the back door, past the garden, to a small rise overlooking the vast expanse of the valley. The wind was gentle here, rustling the tall buffalo grass. Tahan reached into the pouch at his belt. He pulled out something small wrapped in a piece of soft doe skin. He held it out to her. Eliza took it, her fingers brushing his. She unwrapped the leather carefully. Resting in her palm was a necklace. It was simple, yet breathtaking in its craftsmanship. A thin, braided cord of leather held a pendant made from two distinct materials joined together. One half was a polished piece of buffalo horn, black and strong. The other half was a fragment of eggshell, preserved in tree resin so it looked like amber, catching the dying light of the sun. The two pieces were bound together with silver wire, forming a perfect circle. Eliza stared at it, her breath catching. It was the story of her life, the horn of the wild, and the shell of the domestic, the strength of the warrior, and the fragility of the hope she had carried. "Do you remember the day the storm broke your basket?" Tahan asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I remember," Eliza whispered, running her thumb over the resin-encased shell. "You thought you had lost everything," Tahan said. "You thought the nest was destroyed, but the shell has to break for life to begin." He took the necklace from her hand and moved behind her. She lifted her hair, exposing the nape of her neck. He fastened the clasp, his fingers lingering on her skin for a moment longer than necessary. "I have no ring of gold," Tahan said, stepping around to face her. "I have no land deed to give you, for the land belongs to itself, but I give you this circle. It has no beginning and no end. It is the horn that protects and the shell that nurtures." He looked deep into her eyes, stripping away all defenses. "Eliza Hart, will you share my fire? Will you walk this path with me? Not as a guest, not as a traitor, but as my wife." Eliza touched the pendant at her throat. She thought of the fear she used to carry, the fear of Pike, the fear of poverty, the fear of being the virgin joke. She thought of her father, buried now in the small plot behind the farm he had told her to leave. He had whispered to her in his final days, telling her that love was the only land worth fighting for. She looked at Tahan, this man who had crossed a desert of prejudice to stand beside her. "I don't need gold, Tahan," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I don't need a deed, I just need you." She stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. "Yes, I will share your fire. I will share your path. I will be your wife." Tahan let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He didn't shout. He didn't spin her around. He simply leaned his forehead against hers, the Comanche kiss that was their secret language of intimacy. "Then we are one," he whispered. They were married 3 weeks later, on a day when the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. It was not a wedding Dry Creek had ever seen before, and likely would never see again. The ceremony was held in the open air, on the porch of the trading post. Reverend Thomas stood on the left, holding his Bible. Looks Far Woman stood on the right, holding a ceremonial fan of eagle feathers and sage. The guests were a sea of contrasts, bonnets and buckskins, Sunday suits and trade blankets mingling together in the yard. There were no long sermons about obedience or property. The Reverend read a psalm about the hills and the rivers. Looks Far Woman chanted a blessing to the 4 directions, calling on the spirits of the earth to hold the couple up. Eliza wore a dress of cream-colored linen, embroidered with blue flowers by the women of the town. In her hair, she wore a single white feather. Tahan wore a new shirt of soft, bleached doe skin, and around his neck hung a matching pendant of horn and shell. When the time came for the vows, they did not repeat the standard lines. "I choose you," Tahan said in English, his voice carrying to the back of the crowd, "to be my shield and my heart, to build a home where there was only war." "I choose you," Eliza answered, looking up at him with a radiant smile, To be my strength and my shelter, to walk beside me until the mountains wear down to dust. Instead of a kiss on the cheek or a handshake, Tahan stepped forward. The crowd held its breath. This was the moment, the warrior and the white woman. He placed his hands gently on her face. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, a baring of the soul that was far more intimate than any touch of lips. For a long moment, they stood there, breathing the same air. Two halves of a circle finally joined. Then, Tahan pulled back slightly, looked into her eyes with a mischievous glint, and kissed her on the mouth. It was not a chaste peck. It was a kiss of passion, of promise, and of deep, abiding love. A cheer went up from the crowd, a mix of cowboy yips and Comanche trills. It was a sound of pure joy that echoed off the canyon walls. As the celebration began, a feast of roasted venison, cornbread, and apple pies, Eliza found herself standing near the punch bowl. An older woman from town, the widow Abernathy, approached her. She was a woman known for her sharp tongue, one of the gossips who had once fueled the rumors about Eliza, but today, her face was softened by the occasion, and perhaps by the realization that she was standing on the losing side of history if she didn't change. "Well, Eliza," the widow said, fanning herself with a handkerchief, "it is a beautiful day. I never thought I would see the like—" She looked over at Tahan, who was laughing with Lieutenant Miller and a group of warriors. "He is a striking man," the widow admitted. Then, a sly smile touched her lips. "Tell me, dear, after all this time, all the fighting, all the running, did he finally hunt the nest inside you?" It was an old joke, the dirty phrase that had started the war, but the venom was gone from it. It was spoken now with a curiosity, perhaps even a hint of envy. Eliza touched the necklace at her throat. She looked at Tahan, and then back at the widow. She didn't blush. She didn't look away. "No, Mrs. Abernathy," Eliza said, her voice ringing with the confidence of a woman who owns her own soul. "He didn't hunt it." She smiled, and it was a smile like the sun breaking over the red hills. "We built one together." The widow blinked, then chuckled. A genuine sound. "Well, I suppose that is a better way to do it. Good for you, girl. Good for you." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, the music started. A fiddle from the town and a drum from the tribe found a rhythm together, a strange, syncopated beat that somehow worked. Eliza and Tahan danced. They moved together under the vast, darkening sky, spinning in the dust of the trading post yard. To the casual observer, it was just a wedding on the frontier, but to the land itself, it was something more. It was healing. The story of Eliza and Tahan was proof that the Wild West was not just a place of guns, sand, and blood. It was not just a map of conquests and defeats. It was a place where free souls could look past the color of skin and the history of violence to find a common humanity. It was a place where a man could put down his knife and a woman could put down her fear. And together, they could choose their own home. They were not defined by the past that had tried to crush them. They were not defined by the rumors that had tried to shame them. They were defined by the choice they made every morning when they opened the doors of the crossing. High above, a flock of geese flew in a V formation, heading south for the winter, crossing the invisible lines of the territory without asking for permission. Below them, the woman who had once carried eggs to market and the warrior who had once known only battle stood arm in arm, laughing as a group of children, white and Comanche, chased a dog through the garden. This was the New West. It was free. It was hard. But it was theirs. And it was built on a foundation stronger than stone, the responsibility they held for each other. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Eliza and Tahan. I hope their journey through the Wild West touched your heart as much as it did mine. It is a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, understanding and love can blossom if we are brave enough to build bridges instead of walls. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Are you in a bustling city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere in between?
Let's see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to show your support. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners around the world. Your support means everything and helps me keep these legends alive. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your heart open. Safe travels, partners.